This lesson will focus on the United States' entrance into World War I and how General John Pershing, the U.S. general who led the United States Expeditionary Forces into Europe and ultimately defeated the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well as the German Empire, and how that after the war, the Treaty of Versailles was signed in hopes that it would be the war to end all wars. Now, World War I started in 1914, and for the first 3 years, the United States were isolationist. We tried to remain neutral and was trying to avoid going to Europe to fight in this great war. But on April the 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked the Congress for a declaration of war, and his primary reason was to make the world safe for democracy.
So America watches World War I from 1914 to April of 1917. And people ask why. Why doesn't America get involved immediately? And American politicians are petrified of being drawn into a foreign war and fighting for foreign ends.
Remember, the United States is a nation of immigrants. People came here to avoid war in Europe.
The Americans had, from the very beginning, an official policy of neutrality. But neutrality never meant indifference or apathy.
Even though we're saying we don't want to involve ourselves, we certainly were sympathetic in trying to help and aid that cause in ways that the Germans saw as being destructive to their war aims. So in all those ways, the Wilson administration is walking a tightrope.
Woodrow Wilson, after all, runs for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And yet within a year after winning that election, that very same president is declaring war on the Germans.
Ultimately, the triggering event that brings us into the war is Germany's decision to revive unrestricted submarine warfare.
Added to that, the Germans had managed in a particularly ham-fisted way to try and recruit the Mexicans to come in on their side if America entered the war. And they had offered to return to the Mexicans all the lands they had lost in the 19th century to the US, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. The Germans sent this offer to the Mexicans by telegram, Western Union, of all things. Only what they didn't realize was the Western Union office was in London. And so the British captured the telegram and promptly sent it to the US and released it in public. And that angered the American people so much that, combined with unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson felt that he had to take the US into the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary. When America entered the conflict, it changed the war. Although not as much as everybody expected, because just as America was entering the war, Russia was dropping out.
Now, it's a race. As Russia is leaving the war, can the United States get enough troops in to tilt that scale in favor of the Allies?
They brought in the men, the materiel, and the resources that the Allies needed desperately.
The French and the British were suffering a sense that the war was stalemated, that defeat might be coming, and the American commitment was a real shot in the arm for both political leaders and for ordinary soldiers in the trenches.
Prior to the outbreak of World War I, America was recognized as a strong young nation. By joining with the Allies and really helping to bring about the end of the war, we positioned ourselves as one of the world powers for the rest of the century.
So as the United States prepared to enter World War I, a big event happened in Russia. In March of 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution was successful, and the communists took over Russia. And when this happened, the communist leadership withdrew from World War I. So now the country of Germany could move all its forces over to the Western Front and fight France and the Allied powers from that standpoint. So this was a huge part of World War I, and the United States, a country that just entered the war, would be the deciding factor. Because the war had been going on for 3 years, and the forces in Europe were getting very, very low, and also just the morale was very, very low. But when the United States entered the war, the morale went back up because we were able to send fresh troops into World War I. So the summer of 1917 through the fall of 1918, America led the war effort, and we were able to defeat the Central Powers. One of the most significant people at the time was our lead general. His name was General Pershing. Most people don't remember that name today, but if you were alive during World War I, you would certainly know who he was. He became an international hero because he helped to end World War I.
A century ago, World War I raged in Europe. Historians say the war made the U.S. a global superpower. General John J. Pershing, a man with strong Nebraska ties, commanded the U.S. troops that helped to end the bloody fighting. November 11th, 1918, America and the world celebrated an end to World War I.
3,000 miles from home, an American army is fighting for you.
4 years of fighting claimed millions of lives before U.S. troops, led by General John J. Pershing, arrived in France.
Just like Washington crossed the Delaware, so will Pershing cross the Rhine.
They were called the American Expeditionary Forces and joined the French and British to turn the battle tide against the German military. In 18 months, General Pershing helped to transform 220,000 U.S. troops into a fighting force of 4 million.
He should be thought of as a quintessential American man. Right place, right time.
General Pershing became the only acting 6-star general in U.S. history. Today, though, his name is recognized by few people, even in Nebraska, where an important part of Pershing's life unfolded. In 1891, the 31-year-old Pershing thought seriously about leaving the Army after 4 years in the 6th Cavalry. He had commanded frontier outposts in the Indian War, and there seemed to be few promotional opportunities left for First Lieutenant Pershing.
So after times chasing Native Americans in Arizona and other places, he does get a chance to take a break.
Pershing's break was a transfer to the University of Nebraska.
Here in Lincoln, he has a sense of having arrived.
Pershing taught military science at the University of Nebraska and began work on a law degree. Most importantly, Pershing took charge of the school's failing military training program and its 100 cadets.
Underrated, secondhand, nobody gave two hoots about the program.
Under Pershing's command, McNeese says things quickly changed. Pershing instilled something in his cadets that they hadn't had before. It was discipline.
Better button up that coat. You better why are your shoes not polished? And all these farm boys are kind of, wait, who's this guy and why, what?
Within a year, 350 students joined Pershing's UNL Cadet Corps. And by 1892, Pershing's cadets were ready to be tested in a national military drill competition. UNL's elite cadet squad competed in Omaha against veteran teams from across the country. When it was announced that Pershing's UNL cadets had won their division, hundreds of UNL students and faculty climbed over the fence and charged the parade field to celebrate. And they were led by UNL Chancellor James Canfield.
Well, even the chancellor of the university, right. Yeah, Chancellor Canfield, who is not a small man, is climbing over this 8-foot-tall fence.
In 1895, Pershing's time at UNL came to an end. In honor of their recently departed lieutenant, UNL's elite drill team renamed itself Pershing's Rifles. Today, units like them across the country are known as the National Society of Pershing Rifles. In the decades that followed, Pershing commanded U.S. troops in the Spanish-American War. In the Philippines, he was promoted to the rank of one-star general. Now married with a wife and 4 children, Pershing's life seemed complete until tragedy struck in 1915. Pershing's wife Frankie and their 3 young daughters died in a San Francisco fire. The fire's only survivor was Pershing's 5-year-old son Warren. Pershing privately poured his crushing sorrow into the command of 10,000 U.S. troops sent to hunt Mexican Revolutionary General Francisco Pancho Villa. Pershing's son Warren, now the most important person in the general's life, lived in Lincoln, Nebraska with Pershing's 2 sisters.
October 31, 1916. My dear little boy.
Recently, Pershing's granddaughter-in-law read a 1916 letter the general wrote from Mexico to his son in Lincoln.
This small red flag with 1 white star in the center is the flag that has been in front of your papa's tent for several months. As I now must have 2 stars in my flag, I am sending you this one to keep as a souvenir. With it goes all the love of my soul. May God keep you and help you to be a good and great man.
A year later, Pershing would command American troops in World War I.
Only the hardest blows can win against the enemy we are fighting.
America's sacrifices in the Great War were enormous. More than 323,000 U.S. troops died, were wounded, or went missing. America's victory, though, gave the U.S. global recognition as a leader of the free world and a superpower with a modern military. A turning point in John Pershing's long journey that once led through Nebraska.
But if you look at the army that Pershing left behind, it has been turned into a modern force with a large standing army. Pershing wasn't the only architect of that, but he was the most important person to execute that transformation.
So by the fall of 1918, the war was coming to an end. There was no major decisive battle. What really happened was citizens throughout Europe were getting very, very tired of this war. And it's a war in many respects that should have never begun. You remember the acronym MAIN: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Those were the reasons World War I began in the first place. And so citizens by 1918 were very tired of this long world war. And so in November, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Empire of Germany both began to fall apart. And so on November the 11th, 1918, an armistice was signed. Now the term armistice means ceasefire. So Germany, even though they agreed to surrender and agreed to a ceasefire, they actually could have kept fighting. Their forces were still intact, but they too were very tired of World War I. And so on November the 11th, at the 11th hour of the 11th day, on the 11th month, the fighting ended, and the world celebrated. Now keep this very important point in mind. President Wilson basically convinced the German citizens to stop fighting. Well, the Allied forces never entered Germany. Germany was promised by President Wilson to be treated fairly in the peace treaty that was to follow the war.
It wasn't a fighter plane, a tank, or a battleship that spelled the end of the First World War, but a signature in a train carriage made on November 11th, 1918. By the second half of 1918, Germany was in big trouble. It had defeated Russia, but it was losing in France. German forces were being pushed back, and its leaders no longer believed they could win the war. Defeat was coming. One by one, Germany's allies, including Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary, pulled out of the fighting and signed formal agreements to stop the conflict. That's called an armistice, and Germany was ready to sign one too. The Allies, led by Marshal Ferdinand Foch, came up with the agreement. It called for fighting to end, for Germany to evacuate, hand over all of its weapons, and return its prisoners. Germany signed it on the 11th of November 1918 in General Foch's railway carriage, with the armistice officially coming into effect on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. It would be the end of fighting, for a while at least. In the coming years, Germany would be forced to sign more treaties, including the Treaty of Versailles, which officially blamed Germany for the war and forced it to make big repayments to the Allies. Many historians think those terms played a big part in the rise of Hitler's Germany and the start of World War II just 20 years later. But at the time, everyone was ready for the Great War to end. News spread that the war was over.
Queensland Government Gazette, Germany has signed the armistice with the Allies, and that consequently the war that has devastated the world for more than 4 years is at an end.
The guns fell silent, and on the front lines, troops cheered and danced. In London, in Paris, in New York, people celebrated too. After more than 4 years of conflict, war was finally over.
So in January of 1919, the Paris Peace Conference began. And it was dominated by the Big Four, so to speak. That was the United States, the British, France, and Italy. And so those were the four nations that were going to lead the peace treaty. And this peace treaty would reshape not only Europe, but the entire world. And keep in mind that the country of Russia was not invited. The largest country in area in Europe was not invited to a peace treaty that would affect the entire continent. Now, the reason they weren't invited was because of the Bolshevik Revolution. They were still fighting a civil war, so nobody really was in charge in Russia, so they were left out. Now, in future years, that would have a great impact in Europe. Now, when President Wilson arrived in Paris, he had a plan called the 14 Points. And you'll notice all of this is in green, so it's very important. So Wilson's goal was what he called peace without victory. And so if you think of that slogan, what he is really trying to do is to design a peace treaty that will be fair to all nations, with the ultimate goal of preventing future wars like this. And so his plan for peace was called the 14 Points Plan. He had 14 major points to his plan that he hoped would solve the problems that started World War I in the first place. And remember those problems: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Now, if he knew what caused the war, then it would be quite simple to do things to prevent the causes from happening again. For example, if militarism was a problem, meaning large militaries, well, you would simply then reduce the size of everyone's military. So that kind of made sense. Same way with alliances. If you had a lot of secret alliances that started World War I, then stop having secret alliances. And then the big one was imperialism. These larger countries like Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire taking over smaller areas, that caused major conflicts. And so Wilson wanted to see an end to imperialism. Those were his first 13 points. And then his main point, you might consider this his favorite point, was the League of Nations, an international organization that would be set up for countries to go to solve problems before they would erupt into a war.
The 14 Points. On January 8, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson delivered his famous 14-point speech, where he outlined a plan to end World War I and secure world peace. When the war broke out in 1914, Wilson adopted a policy of neutrality, with no intention of involving the U.S. in a foreign war. But the U.S. couldn't remain isolated for long. In January 1917, British intelligence intercepted and decoded a message, known as the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany asked Mexico to ally with them against the United States. Then, on February 1st of the same year, Germany announced unrestricted submarine warfare and started sinking merchant and passenger ships with U.S. citizens on board, something they had agreed not to do after sinking the Lusitania in 1915. The Lusitania, a British ocean liner, was torpedoed without warning, leading to the deaths of over 1,100 people, including 128 Americans. This was the final straw. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Germany. Just 2 days later, on April 4th, Congress declared war. The war was brutal and expensive. In a little under 2 years of fighting, the U.S. had spent $32 billion and lost over 116,000 men. Wilson wanted the war to end, but when announcing his 14 points in January of 1918, Wilson didn't just want to end the war to protect America, he hoped to prevent wars from ever happening again. So together with his advisor and friend, Colonel Edward M. House, President Wilson organized a group of 150 political and social scientists to study Allied and American policy all over the globe, collecting nearly 2,000 reports and 1,200 maps. This would inform the idealistic 14 points, which would address causes of the World War and also propose solutions to ensure world peace in the future through policy and negotiations. 8 of the 14 points were aimed at resolving specific territorial issues among the countries involved in combat, and securing borders and statehood for Italy, the Turkish part of the Ottoman Empire, Poland, and Austria-Hungary. 5 points covered general principles for a peaceful world: open treaties and agreements, freedom of the seas, free trade, reduction of armaments, and adjustment of colonial claims to land. These were all based on the principles of self-determination, the idea that nations should have the right to govern themselves without interference from other countries. The 14th and most influential point proposed that countries form an alliance to guarantee the political independence and territorial integrity of great and small states alike. The 14-point speech reflected a tradition of diplomatic idealism that would come to define Wilson's presidency. But how did that idealism translate into action? Well, most of Wilson's points were never fully realized. But one point in particular would have a big impact on the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I. When the Allies met in Versailles to create a treaty to end the war, they were less interested in Wilson's idealistic vision and more interested in regaining what they had lost and punishing Germany. To Wilson's disappointment, the points were barely integrated, and only to the benefit of the Allies. Most of them weren't actually adopted or honored by anyone after the treaty was signed. However, the 14th point was incorporated: the creation of a world organization providing collective security. This would later be known as the League of Nations. Ironically, despite a campaign from Wilson, the U.S. never actually joined the League of Nations. Wilson foreshadowed that without American membership in the League, there would be another world war within a generation. Sure enough, World War II would break out just 20 years later.
As you look at this diagram, you can see over on the left-hand side Wilson's 14 points. And Wilson, when he arrived in Paris, he had a plan that everyone knew about. It was very public. He had already given speeches about it. And his 14 points all addressed the causes of World War I: Maine, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. In fact, if you look at the very first point, it says, end secret treaties and secret diplomacy among nations. And so that directly addresses alliances, one of the causes of World War I. And then if you go down point by point, it addresses all the other causes, such as militarism. He wanted to reduce the sizes of armed forces throughout Europe, regardless of what nation. Remember, his plan that he promoted was called Peace Without Victory. So what he wanted to see happen was that all nations would agree to reduce the size of their military. And then his most famous point, the very last one, point number 14, was his favorite point, to create the League of Nations. But Wilson had a very serious problem when he arrived in Paris. He, of course, was not going to dictate the terms of peace just by himself. And France, Great Britain, and Italy, they had different goals. I call them the 3 R's. They wanted to see a redistribution of power, they wanted revenge, and they also wanted reparations. They wanted Germany to pay $33 billion. And so they had very different goals than Wilson had. Wilson wanted a peace without a nation taking advantage of Germany. But the other 3 nations that were negotiating peace had far different goals. As the treaty negotiations went on, Wilson had to sacrifice many of his 14 points, but he held on to his main point, number 14, the League of Nations. He felt that if he could not achieve anything else in the peace treaty, if he could simply achieve the League of Nations, that would go a long ways in preventing future wars. And so in June of 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed in Paris. Now, in the United States, according to our Constitution, the President negotiates treaties, but it is the U.S. Senate that must ratify the treaty. That's just a part of separation of powers and checks and balances. And of course, President Wilson knew that. He knew that he would have to come back to the United States and get the Senate to approve of the treaty. Now, when he did arrive, he had one major problem. The Senate was dominated by Republicans, and Wilson was a Democrat, and they were not getting along very well. When the Senate looked at the treaty, they objected to Wilson's favorite point, point number 14, the League of Nations, because as they read the treaty, it looked as though the Senate would have to give up their power in order to join the League of Nations. And remember, the United States, for the first 100 plus years of their history, were isolationist. And they were afraid that if they joined the League of Nations, that they would get entangled in the messy affairs of Europe. In fact, make sure you underline that phrase, foreign entanglements. That was a very common phrase. Remember, World War I was a terrible war. It was a war that was really started for no reason at all, and that most Americans did not want to join. But after 3 years, we were dragged into World War I, and we had to go to Europe and sacrifice many soldiers to maintain the peace in Europe. And so the Senate did not like the League of Nations. And so the Senate and President Wilson debated and argued about this for months. As a result, in the fall of 1919, Wilson decided to take his message to the American public. He went on a train trip all the way across the United States to try to get the American public to support his treaty. But unfortunately for Wilson, on September the 25th, 1919, he collapsed from a stroke in Denver, Colorado, and he was unable to continue his trip. He was rushed back to Washington, D.C. and put under bed rest for many months. Now, Wilson did not pass away, but he was just simply unable to carry out the duties of the president. And as a result, the Senate defeated the treaty that Wilson had negotiated. So that was in March of 1920. The Senate rejects the treaty. The United States never joined the League of Nations, and it returned to the policy of isolationism. And so Wilson's dream of having this international body, the League of Nations, as a place for all nations to come together and peacefully solve their differences, never in its history did the United States join. Now, the League of Nations did exist. Its headquarters was in Switzerland, and for 20 years it did try to maintain peace throughout Europe. But of course, in 1941, World War II broke out, and the League of Nations dissolved. For his efforts, President Wilson was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But he often said that his idea was probably about 20 years ahead of its time, because the United States simply wasn't ready to join an organization in Europe because we were afraid of what was called foreign entanglements. We wanted to go back to isolationism. So President Wilson retires, and in 1920, Warren G. Harding, a Republican, was elected to the presidency, and Wilson spends the rest of his life in Washington, D.C. And in 1924, Wilson passed away at the age of 67.